Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Just bear with us for a moment while we let everybody in from the waiting room. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. This is the program on education policy and governance, Colloquium Series for the fall. If I could introduce our program director, Professor Paul Peterson. Paul.
Welcome, everyone, to the Program on Education Policy and Governance Colloquia. We are very fortunate today to have Chester E. Finn Jr., who is a senior fellow at the Fordham Institute, speaking to us about a subject he knows very well: school accountability, yesterday, today, and perhaps tomorrow. So Dr. Finn is been the head of the Fordham Institute for many, many years. And although he's passed the baton recently, he still is very actively engaged with this very influential organization in American education. Early in his career, he served as Assistant Secretary for Research and Improvement, and he was the counselor to the Secretary at the U.S. Department of Education. And ever since, he has been tracking what the federal government has done, and specifically focused in on the use of the accountability tools to improve American education. And that is the topic that he's going to speak to us today. So thank you very much, Checker, for joining us today.
Well, it's a considerable pleasure to be part of this series. I'm sorry I look like a ghost, but besides being old and gray, the afternoon sun coming in my window always does this to me. And it's a beautiful sunny day in suburban Washington. So I'm glad to be part of the conversation. And you won't have to look at me because you're about to see a series of PowerPoint slides that Michael Poor has agreed to put up on the screen for me, since I'm not very technologically competent. We can go on to the next one, I think, Michael. I want to start with a timeline of key events in the history of school accountability, and then we'll get into current issues and future ideas. I'm going to contend that the modern era of school accountability began in the 60s when two things happened. One is then Education Commissioner Frank Keppel, former dean of the Harvard Ed School, at the time U.S. Commissioner of Education, launched what turned into NAEP, the National Assessment. And he did this because it turned out that the Federal Education Agency really had no information at all about whether kids were learning anything. It had lots of information about how many schools there were and how many teachers there were and how many of this and that there were, but it had no outcomes information. And the commissioner thought that was a problem. And so he asked a very distinguished psychologist at the time named Ralph Tyler, is there anything we could put together that might give us some outcomes information? And thus we have a almost 60-year history of NAEP, which finally got underway toward the end of that end of the 60s. Not shown on the slide, but important, in 1965, the federal government, through the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, launched what amounts to the modern era of federal support for K-12 education. And that was the first time that big bucks had started to flow in a regular, systematic way into public schools, mostly schools attended by poor kids. And that in turn became the trigger, if you will, for federal school accountability, because the basic arrangement is that if states want to keep getting the federal money, mostly under Title I of ESEA, they have to comply with various rules. And it's those rules that include the federally required accountability steps, such as No Child Left Behind and Every Student Succeeds Act. So those are attached to the dollars. In principle, states don't have to do that, incidentally, but only if they want the money, which of course they all do. So the very next year after ESEA, 1966, James Coleman, the eminent sociologist, produced a huge study that was very embarrassing for the Johnson administration, because after analyzing about 8 trillion pieces of data, Coleman concluded and pointed out that there is not a very robust relationship between the resources going into a school and the learning achievement that comes out the other end. This was staggering to American education, all of whom had always assumed that if you want better results, you just pump in more of something, more teachers, more whatever, and you'll get better results. Well, Coleman said it ain't necessarily so, and this was actually so embarrassing to the Johnson administration a year after they had enacted federal aid to education that they brought out the Coleman report on the 4th of July, hoping that nobody would notice. But of course, it has reverberated through American education ever since. In the 1970s, though the main focus of the era was equity in a whole bunch of ways, such as including kids with disabilities in the system and non-English speakers and so forth, the main focus was equity, but a bunch of states discovered to their horror that a lot of kids were graduating from high school who could scarcely read. And so a number of states began to create and impose sort of low-level proficiency tests on high school graduates that they had to pass in order to get their diploma. This was arguably the first stage of accountability, but it was directed more at kids than at schools. And it was not terribly rigorous, but it was finally a recognition that we need to have metrics, and we need to actually see whether kids are learning what they should learn before we just confer diplomas on them. 1983, as you all know, A Nation at Risk declared that the country was in serious trouble due to weak achievement being produced by its schools. And this animated a whole lot of reform efforts, but especially among governors, especially at the start among Southern governors, people like Bill Clinton and Dick Riley and Lamar Alexander, whose states were staggering economically, and who realized pretty quickly that not only was the nation at risk, but their states were at risk. And if they were going to fix their economy, they needed to do something about their schools. And they began asking for better metrics by which to know how how achievement was doing in their schools of their states and how it compared with that of the country and that of other schools and that of any kind of standards that might be used to gauge how it was going, whether it was getting better, things like that. In '85, the National Governors Association, then chaired by Lamar Alexander, a Republican governor of Tennessee at the time, but who has echoed through accountability history and NAEP history for a very long time now, they launched what became a 5-year program called Time for Results, meant to get the governors to focus on, all the governors participated in this, and it did last for 5 years. And it was meant to catalyze reforms in and between states in the K-12 system. During that same decade, some states began to create what we think of as accountability systems with academic standards and measures and subgroup measures and the sort of sorting out of results by student group and by district and by school. A couple states like North Carolina and Texas became famous for this, this turned out to reverberate a little later in American politics and eventually in No Child Left Behind. In 1988, and I was a bit involved in this, as was Bill Bennett, who was Secretary of Education, and I was one of his assistant secretaries. We put together a big study group to re-examine NAEP, which was not producing state level results nor district level results, because at the very beginning of NAEP, big political compromises with districts and states that didn't want to be compared forced NAEP at the outset to not produce comparable information. So it was just producing national information. So the study group proposed big changes in NAEP. One of them was the creation of a new governing board, National Assessment Governing Board, known as NAGB. Another change was that NAEP should start reporting its results at the state level. It should start reporting at grades 4, 8, and 12 instead of ages 9, 13, and 17. And it should at least consider superimposing standards on its scales of scores, so that there'd be metrics, actual benchmarks by which to know whether it was good enough. The very next year, the Charlottesville Summit created the National Education Goals for the year 2000. And one of those goals required, or aspired, I should say, to American kids being proficient in core subjects in grades by the time they left grades 4, 8, and 12. And the new governing board set out to help find definitions of proficiency and metrics that would enable that to happen. And this has began to create the modern NAEP as we know it, not only with state data, but with achievement levels known today as basic, proficient, and advanced, superimposed on those NAEP scores. In 91, President Bush 41 proposed America 2000 as a strategy for achieving the very ambitious set of national goals. Congress didn't do much with that, but 3 years later, with Clinton in the White House, Congress passed both the Goals 2000 law, which pretty much enshrined those national education goals, but also the Improving America Schools Act, which was a reauthorization of ESEA that essentially began to lower the heavy hand of the federal government on states with respect to you're going to be required to have academic standards and assessments. This would reach its ultimate it's 8 years later in NCLB, but it began in 1994. When NCLB came along, that was the work of George W. Bush and Ted Kennedy with bipartisan legislation, picked up very much on what had been happening in Texas by way of accountability, which Bush thought should happen to the nation. And not only required states to create academic standards and assessments and get them approved by Washington, though they could pick whatever standards they liked and whatever tests they liked, but also put in place a set of very onerous specific interventions for low-performing schools. And this will trigger a backlash of shortly after that, as we will see. Big government, too heavy-handed, things like that. Also in NCLB, NAEP now was mandated to test every 2 years in grades 4 and 8, at least in reading and math, at least, which were the NCLB subjects. And this turned NAEP into kind of the auditor, kind of the watching over the shoulder of states to see whether what they were reporting was equivalent to what NAEP thought it should be, basically. And whether it was a way of judging the rigor of state standards, it was a way of judging the rigor of state tests. It was a way of showing states that each had their own standards and their own tests, how they compared with each other. This was, of course, a huge compromise politically. It wasn't national standards or national tests. It was state standards and state tests, but with this national thing called NAEP as a kind of a auditor and monitor and, in a way, equalizer. That delicate balance here between state sovereignty and national interest as defined by the president and Congress. It began to feel onerous to states. And so by 2005, Secretary Margaret Spellings was beginning to issue waivers to states so that they didn't necessarily have to do all those things that NCLB said. But then came the Great Recession and a lot of federal stimulus money. And by now, Barack Obama and Arne Duncan are in charge of the executive branch, and Race to the Top gets going. And that brings a whole bunch more federal rules onto the schools, including the very controversial practical near requirement to embrace the Common Core standards, which turned the Common Core into a big dust up and again made the federal role feel awfully heavy-handed, created that plus a testing backlash fostered in part by the teacher unions, but easily extended to parents who didn't want their kids to take so many tests, led to a reconsideration in Congress that resulted in 2015 by another bipartisan law called ESSA, which basically said, well, states, you got to keep doing standards and testing, but we're no longer, the feds are no longer going to tell you what to do about failing schools. You now decide for yourself what to do about low performing schools. By this point, I should add, I am a member of the Maryland State Board of Education and part of the group that has to decide what to do with Maryland's accountability plan under ESSA. And I will say that Maryland's accountability plan, when it comes to low performing schools, does very little because the political alignment in Maryland didn't want much intervention. Neither the school district superintendents, nor the local school boards, nor the teachers union. And so they went to their friends in the legislature to make sure that the state board didn't make them do anything. And so Maryland has a very weak accountability plan under ESSA. Other states have firmer ones, but that's where things stand today, followed by, of course, the pandemic. Such that in 2020, Secretary DeVos said you don't have to test under ESSA. 2021, last spring, the rule was you had to test, but you don't have to use it for accountability purposes. Upshot is that we have now had 2 years of what I think we could call an accountability holiday with respect to how ESSA is supposed to work and school accountability is supposed to work. Which brings us to the present and to the future. And if you are still there, Michael, please to the next slide. Okay, I'm gonna try not to read all the words on a bunch of slides that have a lot of words on them. I've already pointed out that results-based accountability has been the linchpin of education reform policy. It presupposes that schools ought to be held responsible for whether their students learn what the state wants them to learn, thinks they should learn. But educators, by and large, don't like this accountability. They see it as embarrassing and punitive and unprofessional and so forth. And they don't like outside efforts to intervene. And they also don't like the fact that those scores occasionally get used to judge individual teachers. And so there's been a lot of pushback on testing backlash, which we can still see, which is more worrisome when the testing backlash is joined to a testing holiday, because it raises the question of, are we going to get back to it in the way that it was going before the holiday occurred? Next slide, please, Michael. Keep in mind that accountability could apply not just to schools, but to students and to educators and to districts and even states. Just keep in mind that you could shape an accountability system that way, but the main focus, at least since NCLB, has been at the school level. I have always thought of accountability as a tripod. It starts with academic standards. Here's what the state thinks kids should learn, followed by some kind of measurement to determine whether the kids are meeting those standards, and then some sort of consequences for schools. Can be positive, can be negative, can be helpful, can be intrusive, can be punitive, can be constructive, can be supportive, can be gold stars, based on whether the school's students are meeting the standards or not. I think it's important to add at this point, because I'm pretty much persuaded by it myself, that for this to really work, a proper accountability system also needs to think about the capacity of schools to do any better, and of those that are intervening in them. I think just sort of like whipping a child doesn't make them necessarily improve their behavior. Just painting an F on a school doesn't necessarily cause it to get any better if it doesn't know how to get any better, if it doesn't have the human capital, the curriculum, the leadership, et cetera, for it to get better. So I think we have to think about the capacity issues as well as the three legs of the tripod that we've had for a long time. Next slide, please. Pandemic, as I mentioned, has interrupted accountability. It's produced a shortage of data. It's confounded this with spotty attendance. We've had very weak metrics for gauging the virtual schooling that's been such a big part of pandemic schooling. And then, of course, we've got a widespread and I think legitimate sense that it's wrong to hold schools very much to account for their results during a time when so many factors that are out of their control are in fact contributing to those results, such as people being sick, people dying, kids not being in school, schools being shut down, some schools mounting effective hybrid programs, others not. Some of these things are within the school's control and others aren't. But I will say that if the accountability holiday continues, I think we revert to a situation that I believe would be lamentable, a situation of no consequences for failure or rewards for success, little incentive to correct shortcomings, little incentive to identify and close achievement gaps, little incentive to pursue excellence, little incentive to remedy major learning losses, little information on the basis of which to know any of those things, and a great likelihood that schools will again be judged by their inputs and promises and reputations rather than their success in readying their students for successful participation. If we get to that stage again, I believe all the ancient gaps will remain and our shortcomings will be hidden, and a lot of people will be ill-served by the system that even wasn't serving them so great before the pandemic. Next slide, please. So how to think forward. Assuming this holiday is not going to continue forever and that we really do need to think about the future, long paper I wrote attempts to think beyond ESSA, even though many of the things that I'm going to suggest could be done within ESSA. I think an important philosophical shift is not to, in the future, just to think about proficiency of kids, but actually about their readiness for what follows. It's a very different way to think about what is our goal here. Proficiency is a good thing, a necessary thing, but what we really care about is whether a kid is ready at 4th grade for what is going to happen in 5th grade, is ready at 12th grade for what's going to happen in college, and so forth. Next slide, please. The assessments that we will need in the future, I believe, are somewhat different from those that we have now. And they are, for the most part, to be blunt, more of them, which I understand flies in the face of the anti-testing movement. I believe that kindergarten readiness assessment is essential because it's the baseline against which everything else is gauged. I think we should continue with English and math, of course. I think we should start earlier than grade 3 because I think that's awfully late for early reading to be gauged. I would start in grade 2 at least and go through grade 8. I don't think it would be a crime to do this in alternate years rather than every year. And I think that most of the necessary calculations of student growth can be done with alternate year testing. That would be one way to lighten the burden a little bit. However, I believe that schools should go back to having end of course exams in core subjects, not just in high school, but also in middle school. And I believe that those should include career and technical subjects as well as the traditional academic subjects. Next slide, please. If you've got EOCs in place, you can begin to get closer to diplomas that mean something, because then you can begin to say that the EOCs in those key high school courses have to be passed in order to get that diploma. Now, I know this is a politically hot topic, but I understand that if we mean diplomas to attest to actual accomplishment and especially readiness, we need a way of gauging that. And we don't have that today. We're still mostly using Carnegie units for high school diplomas. At the same time, and here I'm going to go a little soft, but I believe it and mean it, test scores don't begin to do the trick for judging school performance or kid performance. It does matter school climate. It does matter about citizenship and creativity and character development and all these other things that we don't have very good indicators of right now. We ought to have broader metrics for evaluating school performance. And I think we ought to have broader metrics for evaluating student learning and not rely nearly as totally as we do today on the test scores. But I'm also well aware that Those metrics are harder to create and make them reliable and trustworthy and not corruptible. School climate's awfully hard to gauge, for example, without surveys, and surveys are corruptible. And so how to work this into the accountability algorithm, I think, is going to need a lot of work, but I think it is well worth undertaking. Next slide, please. As we go forward, I think achievement and growth should remain core criteria with disaggregation that you're acquainted with through NCLB and ESSA. I think states should continue with NAEP. I think NAEP could do a whole lot more good if it provided state level results at the 12th grade level, which by and large it does not do today. The state level NAEP results are basically limited to grades 4 and 8, which I see as a almost bizarre gap in NAEP reporting, since end of high school, it matters so much. I do believe in giving schools ratings based on their performance. A lot of people don't like that, but I think it's very helpful to parents and mayors and taxpayers and so on. Next slide, please. As for consequences for schools, what do? You should reward good ones. Of course, truly weak schools do need some kind of a major overhaul, but we haven't been very good at that over the years, at figuring out how to do that, partly because politically dicey to intervene in a big way in a school and change anything important about it. So we've got a weak track record on school interventions. I don't think that means we should quit trying. Intervening, closing schools, politically dynamite, but it's some cases probably needs to happen. Then there are a whole bunch of schools that aren't truly weak but have shortcomings. They need beefing up if you're going to get to, and okay schools do too. If you're going to get to continuous improvement or good to great, we need to think about those schools too, not just the really weak ones. But beyond top-down interventions from outside, I've really come to believe that sometimes the most prudent course is to let the kids leave and go to better schools. So I actually believe that marketplace forces and school choice are an important remedy for kids otherwise stuck in low-performing schools that we seem unable to fix or do anything about. The remedy is exit visas for kids and a supply of better alternatives for those kids. That is, you could say that's not school accountability, but it is a necessary thing for kids whose education is going to be wrecked by low-performing schools. We're almost at the end, I believe. Next slide, please, Michael. I think we should resume school-level accountability as soon as possible, preferably the end of this year. I've already mentioned the need for broader gauges of learning and school effectiveness, equity, and well-being. And I also want to just sort of note here that measures that don't make the reliability test and therefore maybe shouldn't be counted for formal accountability can nevertheless provide valuable formative feedback for teachers and educators. I believe there's another slide or two. Michael, please go on. It'd be great to incorporate more parents and community leaders and build wider support for accountability itself. There's a lot of federal recovery money flowing right now, and if it's intelligently used, it could be used to build capacity of schools to strengthen achievement. It could be used to build capacity of districts and states to intervene more effectively. It could be used to create more quality options for kids to escape into. And finally, as I said already, I believe the consequences should come in two forms, both effective interventions and alternatives for students in situations where the school can't be fixed. So I believe I have taken up plenty of time with 12 PowerPoints. I think we will call a halt there, and I will call a halt and open it up for conversation. Thanks for paying attention. And I'm sorry I still look like a ghost.
Well, thank you, Checker, for a fantastic presentation. You've opened up so many topics here. I know we're going to have a lot of questions. We are in a seminar format, so you can actually unmute yourself and ask a question at the appropriate time. I'm going to be, so think of your questions. You can, I prefer you sort of indicate through the chat or by raising your hand virtually so that we can keep track of you. But if you just raise your hand, maybe Antonio will spot you out there. I'm going to begin the questioning by asking a couple of questions that I think Checker has already heard from me, but I want to pose them again for general consideration here. And that the first one is, well, we've had accountability in place for at least 2 decades, maybe 3 decades, maybe more. But we have, over the last 20 years on the NAEP, not seen much in the way of progress. We saw some progress in the first decade of the 21st century, but in the second decade, we've seen it level to downward trending even before COVID. Of course, it's even worse now. So, 20 years should be long enough for us to evaluate how well a school reform is going to work. What reason should we have, why should we have any confidence that accountability is going to do much for us in the future?
Well, we've been doing a lot of other things at the same time, of course, over these 20 years, and a lot of other things have been happening at the same time over these 20 years. You're correct that there were gains, notable gains in the first decade, especially for poor kids, especially in the earlier grades, especially in math. 12th grade, incidentally, has been pretty flat throughout, and that's worth taking seriously. High schools have been pretty flat throughout, and that's something to worry about. Why did it level off in the younger grades? Nobody can be sure, of course. Test scores can never give you causal explanations. You have to theorize about what changed. My Fordham colleague, Mike Petrilli, thinks it might have been the Great Recession and the number of kids cast into poverty in around 2010, and the number of schools that lost money and resources out of their budgets around that time. That's his theory. I could argue that it was actually the weakening of accountability as waivers began to be given and people began to say, we don't really have to do this. Margaret Spellings will let us off the hook, and began to look towards something like us letting states off the hook. Other possibilities, it may be that some people have suggested that accountability only carries you so far, that it carries you up for a while, and then there's going to be a plateau, and you need to think about other things. And maybe that we need to think about those capacity questions and those leadership questions and those governance questions and those political questions that and incidentally also those school choice questions that are regarded as too hot to handle. So I don't think we should layer everything on the back of accountability every time there's a blip in test scores.
So I have lots of things I would like to ask about, but I'm gonna exercise a little self-discipline and ask Brian Gill if he's put a couple of ideas in the chat here. Do you want to pose them live?
Sure. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Checker. This has been a lot of fun to hear. So I've got a bunch of questions. We've had to think about accountability in particular, and more broadly, school performance measures used for other purposes in the work that we do on the Mid-Atlantic Regional Educational Lab and some other work. And in fact, so the first question I have is related to a project that we actually did there in Maryland, and I'm not sure if you're aware of it or not. But you mentioned, you'd like to see kindergarten readiness assessments done more regularly. As you know, Maryland has one. We actually did a study for the Maryland State Department of Education that demonstrated you can measure, in essence, you can produce a median school growth percentile for elementary schools using that kindergarten entry assessment as a baseline, and therefore measuring growth from K to 3 rather than just in 4 and 5 as any other state does. And I'm wondering if you see any prospect of that being, if not used for formal accountability, then at least used for publicizing results for growth in the early grades of elementary school.
Well, yeah, it was the Maryland experience in part that made me recommend kindergarten readiness testing. The Maryland system works pretty well. It worked better when it was universal kindergarten readiness assessment for every kid. Let's be clear that politics entered in here too, because the teachers didn't like giving it. They took time. It was a bother. It was, kindergartners don't take paper and pencil tests. They basically get what amounts to a teacher inventory of the kids' skills and characteristics. And that's got to be done one by one. And kindergarten teachers hated doing this. They persuaded the union to persuade the legislature to turn it into a sample instead of a census of kindergartners. This is a big loss. Some districts are using it as a census because it's hugely informative also for kindergarten and first grade teachers. It's also a source of potential feedback for pre-K. And if we're going to universal pre-K, a la Joe Biden, we might want to know whether kids emerging from it are ready for kindergarten at that point. Accountability for pre-K, let's hear it for that. So yeah, I'm all for this, and every state should do it.
So Tom Kane, you have a question in the chat here. Do you want to articulate it?
So first, I just wanted to chime in on the we haven't made progress point. Like, I think actually we have way underappreciated the improvements we made from 1990 through 2010, although we did flatten out in 2010. A 0.4 standard deviation increase in 8th grade math, a 0.6 standard deviation increase in 8th grade math. Some states like North Carolina saw a full standard deviation increase in 8th grade math achievement. Like, if you had said, is it possible to move a whole state within 20 years by more than the black-white achievement gap was in 1990? I would have said impossible, and yet that's what happened. So yes, 12th grade scores have been flat, but high school graduation rates have also been going up. So there more would have been dropouts being tested in 12th grade. And we've got a paper that we're working on now where we've been looking at the long-term outcomes in states like North Carolina that saw big increases in 8th grade math scores and look at, okay, well, what happened to those cohorts in terms of their earnings, their educational attainment, their arrest rates? And I think we've overlooked some important changes, but that wasn't the main reason I raised my hand. So there were some byproducts of the No Child Left Behind Act. So there were some byproducts of the focus on accountability that I think we need to keep in mind as we think about changes to the accountability system, because maybe they weren't central to the accountability purpose, but they generated lots of other benefits. And that is the consecutive year testing. That led to an explosion in research on teachers starting around 2003, where it suddenly became possible to learn a lot more. We learned a ton about, the payoffs to teaching experience, the difference between certified and uncertified teachers, and, a number of states began to use those kinds of things for teacher level value added, but also lots of interventions that get implemented during a school year, like a textbook or other educational software. It's useful to have a baseline measure. So if we do adjust the accountability system to be less than consecutive grades, like move to alternate grades, we should be mindful of the fact that we will be losing some of these side benefits that we've been benefiting from the last 20 years. It may not just be about accountability. The accountability system has spillovers into lots of other aspects of the education system.
Just a brief response. I mean, everything Tom said is true, but it also has to be said that the biggest single trigger of the testing backlash was the use of these annual kid grade scores to evaluate teachers.
Yeah. We're not having a debate about that, because that arguably is part of the accountability system. What I'm trying to say is we've learned a lot from these consecutive grade scores. Like back in 2002, there were so many things about which we did not have consensus, and that was what's the difference in effectiveness between a first, second, or third year teacher? Is the average effectiveness of a certified teacher different from an alternatively certified teacher? Like, how do teacher preparation programs differ? Also, can we use baseline test scores to measure the causal effects of schools and textbooks and other things?
All that gold mine of data remains available for further analysis. You're right about everything you said. But
going forward, it would mean that a new textbook, so any new textbook published in the future, the only way we're going to evaluate it is to run a randomized trial.
Well, we have to deal with the reality of the testing controversy, and we cannot pretend it's not there. There was an alarming piece 6 months or so ago in Education Next about the testing backlash and the inevitable war on accountability that leads to. And so we've got these trade-offs, and sadly, this one is really hard to navigate.
Yeah. So all I'm saying is we have to be aware of some of the other benefits of consecutive grade testing that we would be forfeiting.
Duly noted. I am aware of them.
All right, guys, I'm going to let you duke it out on another platform, but I do want to give Jeremy Perdigo. Do I have your name pronounced correctly, Jeremy? Are you there, Jeremy?
Yes, sir, I'm here. It's actually Pedigo, but
Pedigo. Okay.
yes, sir.
Sorry
Thank
about
you
that.
so much.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. I kind of just included the chat about. I'm a community college instructor here in Houston, Texas, and I teach government political science, and some of my classes are non-dual credit classes. Some of them are dual credit, where the high school students taking college classes. But overall, I've just found the last couple of years, I say last couple of years, 5 or 10 years, that many high school students aren't acclimated with college. I mean, we're not all acclimated, but it's like a large gap. It's almost like a shock starting college, and that. I just kind of wonder what high school, and we had to think about this. These students, just like us, we went to, kindergarten through 12th grade. They're all kind of built around this mindset of a certain bureaucratic institution of going through schools. We learn rules going to school. There's certain, guidelines. We don't have a lot of flexibility as students growing up, rules we have to follow. And then when we go to college, we have a lot more independence. And it's almost like a shock to them. It's kind of like, here, you have freedom to make decisions. But I think a lot of students, they don't really understand the college environment, like the norms of college. And, for example, in Texas, a lot of schools, I don't know if this is a statewide policy in Texas, but in Texas, for example, and you may have that in your states too, like, if a student doesn't make a certain grade, like a 70, then teachers, my understanding, are required to allow them to keep retaking the test or assignment until they make a 70, which is a C. But it's, in college, you don't have that. And, these students aren't understanding like, no, you only have one chance or whatever the rules are by the instructor. But it's even things like lecture format, they're used to a more structured curriculum, where in college you have a more flexible curriculum. And so it's just things like that, writing and research skills. I actually created a new project this year that I'm doing a study on. It's called Project 44. It's a writing and research project where students are learning how to use writing and research skills in government classes, like writing, so they can be prepared to do research and writing in their future classes. Their employer, I spent 20 years in the public sector before I got into teaching full time, but I'm just finding that there's just different areas that these students, there's just a large gap. I mean, it's kind of like going from high school to the NFL and football or something. I mean, there's a big gap. It's the speed, the size, and that these students there's just a big jump. We always talk about that jump being a freshman or ninth grade, going from, junior high or middle school to high school. But when it comes to 12 to college, I'm just seeing a humongous difference. I mean, it's almost, you have to reteach the students again
So
about
Checker,
things
how do
that,
you respond to that? The kids aren't ready for college, so.
Well, they're K-12 is mandatory, it is universal, and it needs to have some rules. And one of the things it's supposed to do is equip kids not only with external discipline, but also with a measure of internal self-discipline and the ability to cope with increasing degrees of freedom. Now, good high schools produce increasing degrees of freedom as kids proceed through high school. More choice among courses, greater trust during the lunch hour. You might go off campus. Good high schools are supposed to get kids more ready for the outside world, including the college environment. They don't all do that, and not all kids respond well to that. But high school, let's just keep in mind that college is voluntary. It is meant to be adult. It has very few rules. I would say often too few, in my opinion. But that a good high school has done a gradual transition for kids to be ready for that environment. A bad high school maybe didn't.
So we have an interesting question from Eliza Williams here. There's a lot of talk going on in the States about moving to formative assessments rather than summative assessments. And so Eliza, could you phrase your question for everyone?
Can you all hear me?
We
Okay.
can hear you, yeah.
I'm just wondering if there's going to be a growing trend coming up in the next couple of years of states choosing to get rid of their summative standardized assessments and replace them with interims like map testing in the fall, winter, and spring. So you can actually show student growth. So a child who is technically a fifth grader who normally has to sit and take a fifth grade standardized test is instead taking an adaptive computer test. And we're seeing actual skills and abilities that particular student has. And so wouldn't states be more interested in showing their growth through an assessment that's adaptive rather than churning the same wheel of these summative standardized tests that just show at the grade level?
Well, I, for one, am a fan of adaptive testing, and I'm a fan of formative assessment as something that's beneficial for teachers, for principals, for curriculum directors, and sometimes for parents if it's shared correctly. So all of that is good. The question still is, what are we using to evaluate school effectiveness? There's some very interesting experiments underway to see whether formative assessments can be, as they say, rolled up into the equivalent of a summative assessment at the end of a year. And if that can be done, I think the jury's still out. Then there's some potential here that the formative assessments might serve this additional, very important, I think, purpose. But let me also say, in a discussion session the other day, somebody pointed this out, that within a lot of schools and states, there's very much anxiety about the states creating formative assessments. Because if the state creates formative and mandates formative assessments, the teachers feel more constrained about curriculum and instruction and pacing and scope and sequence and all the things currently schools feel very free about to do in their own way. And so if you had 3 or 4 formative assessments during the year that the state was creating that everybody had to give to their 5th graders, there'd be a new backlash from districts, schools, and teachers that feel like they ought to be making up their own versions of this according to where they and their kids and their curriculum are. So if you're willing to go with a statewide curriculum and statewide formative testing and essentially a statewide system rather than a locally and school level determined system of instruction, okay. But if you really want local control of these things about pedagogy and curriculum, the formative assessments probably have to stick with the people that are doing pedagogy and curriculum.
So I have a question that I would like, you mentioned that we could go to sort of student level testing in at least in the high schools, and have a broader range of courses that we would use that testing for, see whether or not students are really accomplishing what they're supposed to accomplish to prepare them for college or career. How realistic is this suggestion? Is this something politically that we could now do? I can remember years ago when the head of the American Federation of Teachers actually endorsed this idea, saying, well, you know, we don't hold hospitals responsible for patients who just smoke and drink and carry on, but we do expect schools to teach kids regardless of the effort that they make. So why don't we hold students accountable?
Well, especially at the high school level, the end of course exam idea, which is attached to courses rather than grade levels, and applies to kids more than to schools, though you can apply it to the schools that the kids attend. Lots of states were giving lots of end of course exams 6-8 years ago. New York State was using its Regents exams in this way across the whole state as essentially end of course exams in core subjects. But there's been a huge fall off in end of course exams. I think there are 1 or 2 left in Maryland. I think there are a few left in Texas. There are a handful of states that still have a few, sometimes in a math course, sometimes in US history, sometimes in civics. I think that this is a very good idea for, especially as kids begin to differentiate in high school in what they're taking and what they want to do after high school. I think that that this allows a degree of individualization and student level accountability and readiness assessment. And yes, you can trace these things back to the school that the kid attends. If 25 kids in a US history course are taking the state's end of course exam in US history and only 5 of them pass it, you might ask what's not right with the way that school is handling US history, or that teacher is handling US history. So I think it can be used both ways, but it feels like more testing, and states have been rolling back their end of course exams.
Well, I am afraid you're right in raising a question about the political feasibility of something that I think might solve a lot of the issues that are out there. But let's turn to Asher Miller, who asked a question about high-performing schools. Asher, are you still with us?
Yeah, sorry, I can't turn my video on right now, but yeah, I was just wondering, earlier in your presentation, you had mentioned that there should be incentives and we should be rewarding schools that do perform well. So I was just wondering what that can look like, because I think I'm really used to hearing what the kind of what the stick can be or what the punitive consequences can be for poor performance, but wondering what kind of incentives you would encourage states giving.
Well, they could take so many different forms. The simplest and most obvious in states that are giving ratings is you give a school an A or 5 stars, and then more people want to attend it. Their teachers and principals feel prouder of themselves. The people win the Principal of the Year award from their state. They get a lot of sort of secondary benefits from just the rating itself. If you go beyond that, and I would, you can provide cash awards to schools like that. In Ohio, there's extra cash within the charter school system for high performing charter schools. They actually get more money from the state if their performance is strong. You can do that with district schools as well. You can give a variety of other benefits to the school, freedom from certain regulations, for example, various degrees of self-control, self-management over calendars, staffing, budget, you name it. I think that that you could begin to be very creative about the ways of rewarding a successful school, and then continuing to reward it as long as it remains successful. I'm all for that, and we shouldn't just be thinking about all this as a punitive system. We should be thinking about this as an incentive system as well.
Well, the other side of the coin is a low performing school. How do you identify that? Now, my own view of that is we should find out which schools parents are leaving or having their child go to another school instead. To me, that's the very definition of a low performing school. But Brian Gill raises this question, so let me allow him to put forth that his concerns in that regard.
Thanks, Paul. So Checker, as you know, a lot of states started including growth measures or value-added measures in their accountability system in the years after NCLB was passed, in part as a response to a recognized flaw of NCLB, which is that the status measures, proficiency levels, graduation rates, don't distinguish the school's contribution from the differences in the student characteristics, things outside the control of schools, in the words you used. And so I'm wondering, just conceptually, how you think of what a low performing school is, and what is even the rationale for combining a value added growth or growth measure with a status measure, given that we can in fact apply statistical techniques not just to the test scores, but we could do the same thing for graduation rates, for college readiness. In fact, my colleagues and I have done this in Louisiana and in DC, measuring what we call the promotion power of high schools in promoting graduation, college entry, even earnings of, when kids, no longer kids, are in their mid-20s. So my question is, when we want to identify low performing schools, shouldn't we be doing that entirely based on some measure of their contribution rather than producing some hybrid that isn't conceptually coherent and can lead you to identify some very different kinds of schools as being low performing?
Well, yes and no is the answer. At the high school level, sure, long-term information about kids post-high school performance would be probably the very best thing to have. It's hard in a lot of cases to get to track kids to get the information as they go off in many different directions. But I absolutely favor that at the high school level. Elementary and middle school is a different story there. We have to have both status measures and growth measures. And the legitimate question is, what's the balance? Is it 50-50? Is it 60% achievement and 40% growth? The growth alone is a great measure of the school's value add, but it doesn't tell you whether the kids are where they need to be. It just tells you that they're getting better. You can have everybody making phenomenal growth and still be illiterate.
Yes, so I totally agree with that. My point is that not that we should get rid of the status measures, but that we should keep them separate from the growth measures.
Well, I think you have to use both in judging a school's effectiveness.
Right, but if you want to identify the lowest performing schools, don't you want to identify the ones that are having the weakest impact, that are not contributing to their students' growth?
This is almost not a discussion worth having. You want to know about the weak impact, but you also want to know about the weak achievement. So I want to know whether a school with great impact is still producing kids who can't read and write.
Right, right. My point is you'd want to have different interventions for a
Okay.
school, right?
That's not an identification question. That's an intervention. That's a calibrating the intervention strategy question.
All right, we're going to give the last question to Ira Stoll, who wants to know whether the pandemic is not holding schools accountable all by itself. So Ira, what's your question?
Yeah, you sort of described the pandemic as an accountability holiday or interrupted accountability, but we've seen all these reports of parents moving their children from public schools to private schools that were open when the public schools were closed, or even homeschooling. And so I wonder if you might rethink your definition of an accountability holiday in light of what you said at the end of the presentation about accountability serving as a non-top-down, students leaving serving as a non-top-down accountability measure.
Well, at a rudimentary level, you're right, but that's like saying that in the middle of a famine, people will gravitate to any place that has a piece of bread. It doesn't mean that they're gravitating to effective schools. It means that they are exiting from hopeless situations into something they think might be better, just because it's going through the motions of functioning. It's certainly at a rudimentary level. It's a gauge of failure more than anything else. As Paul said, people exit schools that they think have failed. And the pandemic has produced a lot of schools that have failed in a lot of different ways.
Well, thank you very much, Checker, for this lively, informative discussion of one of the major issues that the educational system is facing today. We have enjoyed your presentation. We've been listening to Chester Finn, who is a senior fellow at the Thomas Fordham Institute. Please join us for our next PEPG seminar, which is, I think, is scheduled for November 4th. And we're going to have James Blue, who was another Secretary of Education. He was the Deputy Secretary of Education during the Trump administration. So we invite you to join us on that occasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.